Welcome back to my devlog for Aerodyn, a 2D platform I've been working on for the past couple of months for my college capstone. As I wrap up development on this project, I'll be making a few retrospective videos looking back over my design process and discussing the lessons I learned along the way. Today's focus will be on level design. Level design is one of the most important elements for a 2D platformer, possibly the most important, second only to the core mechanics and physics. The layout of the level is integral to producing the desired feel, as well as dictating how each of these mechanics were used. So in this video, we will be covering 3 topics related to level design: the design objectives, my level design process, and the obstacles I encountered along the way. Let's not waste any more time and just dive right into it. Let's start with discussing the goals I set out to achieve when designing the main level of the game. As I mentioned in my first video, my primary goal was to create an open level with as much space for freeform movement as possible. At the same time, the player had to be challenged enough by the level design to incentivize creative use of their abilities. Again, going back to the balance between experimentation and mastery. To maintain this balance, I set out 3 sub-goals to aim for. First, there should be a variety of routes to choose from. Some should be easier and more obvious than others, with the possibility of strategies I didn't even plan for. But there should be a guaranteed route through the level that the player has the option to follow. Second, each subsection of the level should have its own identity, to both aid level memorability and aid the player in navigating the level. After all, I'm hoping the player will replay the level to optimize their route, so it's important that they actually recognize where they are in each level. Lastly, the level should have a memorable feel to it. This applies more to the artistic direction, but design also contributes to the unique identity each level has. Basically, the level should have character as well as being functional and fun to play. Laying out these design goals was a bit of a challenge at first, but fortunately I had a well-established design process that I've used on past projects, and it was fairly easy to apply in this context. First, I brainstormed concepts to include in the level based on my original goals. I already knew the overall theme of the stage beforehand. I wanted to create a deep valley the player was climbing out of, with wind as a primary mechanic. I came up with a level themed around windmills, which had potential for both game mechanics and unique environments. Next, I sketched out a general map of the level based on the windmill theme. The goal at this stage was just to establish a critical path for the level, a simple flow between level sections, and how they interconnect. I drew up various landmarks and set pieces to occupy these spaces. For example, there's this windmill floating in the middle of the map, which can be climbed on either side or entered directly and ascended from the inside. Next, I drew up the level a second time, this time on grid paper. The first map couldn't really be used to create a level design directly, since it isn't drawn to scale, which is what the second map is for. To help with this, I took note of the player's movements when making this map, such as tracking how high and far they could travel with a jump, double jump, or dash jump. These values helped me to determine how easy or hard a given route would be, how far away to place different items, and how big the map should be. Turns out I underestimated the total size of the map a little bit, as you can see by how big it ended up being, but I got it done either way. With the map completed, I could finally recreate the level in Unity. The goal at this stage isn't for the level to look pretty, but for it to just be functional. That is what's known as white boxing in the industry, based on how the level looks like it's made of just white boxes. This stage of design allows for rapid changes to be made to the level during continuous testing, in case the grid map isn't quite accurate to what would be ideal when playing. After the white boxing stage, the level design process is mostly done, at least for the purposes of my project. I made some minor changes based on repeated playthroughs to improve the flow of the level, or, in other words, how easy it is to get from one point to another. Other than that, the level is pretty much done. I even built the level's art directly on top of the white box, which I'll get into a bit more in the art video. But having a solid roadmap ahead of time didn't make the design process effortless. So let's talk about the difficulties I encountered in this project. First, it turns out whiteboxing is very time consuming. Matching the level grid block for block, is a bit tedious, but there are ways to speed things up. Unity has a built-in grid system, and the scale function will snap to each of these grid points automatically if you hold Control while rescaling. Also, reassembling the level itself was a fun challenge. Finding the most efficient way to recreate the level geometry with the fewest boxes possible was kind of like working on a puzzle. Second, balancing flow with challenge was, well, a challenge. Take this bottom area of the level. These grottos are the closest to the intended route, but because of the outcropping, it can be a pain to navigate, even with the various movement tools the player has at hand. I was constantly running out of multi-jumps, which you might remember are tied to a limited resource the player must recharge. Turns out the solution was twofold: simplify the level geometry and increase passive regen speed. Thirdly, the mostly vertical level design opened the door to some player frustration. The problem is pretty obvious. Falling to the bottom of the stage can cost the player a sizable amount of time, and this risks them leaving the game altogether. The problem actually solved itself in a way, since the player not only possesses limited flight as a secondary ability, but the larger pieces of level form a pseudo-floor that the player will usually not fall past, limiting the amount of progress they can lose. That, and there's no built-in penalty for falling, not yet anyway. Last, and the hardest problem to solve, was actually guiding the player through the level. You see, with horizontal levels, there's only ever one way to go, to the right, which is pretty intuitive for most players. But in this level, the player can go up, forward, even backwards after leaving the starting area. Distant platforms are usually pretty difficult to see, making for a few unfortunate leaps of faith. I planned to add more background art to emphasize intended routes, but at the moment it's a problem I haven't fully solved. But that about covers the level design process in my project. In the next video I'll be covering one of my favorite aspects of game design, art design. Thank you for your time, and I hope to see you then.